Welcome to this training video on disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, DDR. This training video will help you to plan and implement DDR processes in your own country. Before I explain to you what you will learn in this video, let's quickly recall what D, D and R actually means. Disarmament is the collection, documentation, control and disposal of small arms, explosive, light and heavy weapons of combatants and also often the civilian population. It also includes the development of responsible arms management programs. Demobilization is the actual formal and controlled discharge of active combatants from armed forces or other armed groups. Reintegration is the process by which ex-combatants acquire civilian status. They also gain sustainable employment and income through this process. It is essentially a social and economic process with an open time frame, so it's long-term. It's part of the general development of a country and a national responsibility and often necessitates long-term external assistance. By the end of this training video, you will be able to explain the purpose of DDR. You will be able to identify what are the target groups of DDR, so who can actually join in these processes and who will benefit from these processes. And you will also learn what the DDR process is all about and what are its components. This training video is based on the Integrated Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration Standards, the IDDRS. The IDDRS is a comprehensive set of policies, guidelines and procedures for undertaking DDR. It's a vast compendium of modules which cover many different areas. Of course, in this training video, we will only be able to provide you a very brief overview of what DDR is all about. If you're interested in learning more about D, D and R, I would strongly advise to take a look at the IDDRs themselves. They are available online at unddr.org.
In this video, we are going to tackle the content in three main parts. The first part is going to talk about Ddr Processes and Programs. The second part is going to tackle DDR-related tools. And the third part is going to talk about reintegration. Remember that after each section, you will have a small task to fulfill, so be alert. In the first part of our video on Ddr Processes and Programs, you will be able to explain what the purpose of DDR is, define who it is for, and also explain what possible DDR processes exist and when they can be used. Remember always, it's very important to conduct a pre-assessment whenever you implement DDR programs, and also keep in mind the 10 guiding principles. We will hear more about this in this part.
The Central African Republic's most powerful rebel groups have formed an unlikely alliance against the government. They've captured large parts of the country and are threatening to take the capital, Bangui. Nearly 250,000 people have been displaced by fighting since December. Aid agencies warn they're struggling to help those affected. This is what you need to know about the unfolding crisis in the CAR. This is a country already reeling from years of war and instability. It all started in 2013 when a coalition of mostly Muslim armed groups called the Seleka marched on Bangui. President Francois Bozize, who took power in a coup 10 years earlier, was pushed out. The Seleka was soon accused of brutality. Shortly after the coup, mostly Christian militia groups called Anti-Balaka took up arms and the country descended into civil war. In 2014, a United Nations peacekeeping mission called MINUSCA was formed to stop the fighting. And eventually, in 2019, an elected government led by Faustin Archange Touadéra signed a peace deal with the armed groups.
DDR is a process through which members of armed forces and groups are supported to lay down their weapons and return to civilian life. DDR processes can contribute to stabilization efforts and to creating an environment in which peace processes, political and social reconciliation, access to livelihoods, and decent work and sustainable development can take root. Who is it for? DDR is for members of armed forces and groups who served in combat and/or support roles. Those in support roles are often referred to as being associated to armed groups. Abductees or victims, but also dependents and families, civilian returnees, or self-demobilized, and community members. To understand the importance of the 10 guiding principles, let's hear from Nikolai.
Based on the experience and lessons learned from decades of implementing DDR programs and related activities, predominantly in Africa but also in other parts of the world, the international community agreed upon 10 commonly accepted guiding principles for DDR. The integrated DDR standards, which are considered the custodian of DDR policies and practices, state that DDR processes shall be voluntary, people-centered, gender-responsive and inclusive, conflict-sensitive, context-specific, flexible, accountable and transparent, nationally and locally owned, regionally supported, integrated and well-planned. In the following, I would like to focus on 3 of the 10 guiding principles for DDR. Let me start by elaborating on the need for DDR-related activities to be nationally and locally owned. When planning for a national DDR process, governments often turn to the international community for assistance. It remains, however, the responsibility of national governments to ensure the coordination between government ministries and other national actors, including regional ministries and the civil society, and with international partners. The capacity of national institutions is critical in this context. If DDR expertise is not readily available, it needs to be systematically developed. For this, we can use a variety of measures. Firstly, creating national and local institutional capacity. For this purpose, international partners such as the United Nations can provide technical assistance, training and financial support to establish capable, representative and sustainable national institutions. In many contexts, this entails the creation of a national DDR commission to eventually lead all efforts related to DDR in country. At this step, it is already important to have an initial assessment about the type of DDR activities to be implemented. Secondly, identifying national implementing partners such as civil society groups for the implementation of DDR, especially at local and community level. Special attention should be given to women's civil society groups to ensure equal participation as partners in DDR processes. The technical capacity of civil society groups often also needs strengthening. Thirdly, local communities and authorities play a key role in ensuring the sustainability of DDR efforts. In addition to ex-combatants and their dependents, and women and girls formerly associated with armed forces in groups, local authorities and populations shall be involved in the planning and implementation of DDR processes. This is to ensure the needs of both individuals and the community are addressed. Increased local ownership builds support for reintegration and reconciliation efforts. As a practical example, to illustrate the importance of national and local ownership in the context of DDR, I would like to refer to the role of the National DDR Commission in Sudan, from where I am currently recording this video. The Commission was established following a peace agreement in Sudan in the early 2000s and has overseen national DDR processes ever since. At several stages of the peace process in Sudan over the past decades, the National DDR Commission led on a broad variety of initiatives, such as the development of a national DDR strategy for Sudan, a related inclusive planning process, and the implementation of the national DDR strategy through a coordination mechanism involving both international and national partners, including civil society organizations. The example of the Sudan DDR Commission highlights 2 additional DDR guiding principles, starting with DDR efforts required to be context-specific. Each DDR process needs to be tailored to address national, regional, and global realities. DDR should consider the nature of armed actors, conflict drivers, peace opportunities, gender, as well as community dynamics. It therefore remains essential that national institutions lead on the planning and implementation of DDR. And finally, I would like to stress the importance of DDR being both gender responsive and inclusive. DDR processes should aim to address the specific needs of women and girls, as well as men and boys, taking into account their different experiences, roles, capacities and responsibilities acquired during and after conflicts. Specific measures should be put in place to ensure the equal participation of women in all stages of DDR. Therefore, it's important that the eligibility criteria for DDR shall not discriminate against individuals on the basis of sex, age, gender identity, race, religion, nationality, ethnic origin, political opinion, or any other personal characteristics or associations.
Now that we have seen what is the purpose of DDR, who is it for, and what are important principles in conducting DDR processes, let's take a look at what possible DDR responses exist and when they can be used.
The disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of armed groups has continuously adapted to conflict dynamics, aiming at contributing to national security and stability. To fulfill this objective, DDR has evolved beyond support to national linear and sequenced DDR programs to become an integrated process addressing the entire peace continuum in both mission and non-mission settings at regional, national, and local levels. In the past, traditional DDR programs, also known as first generation DDR and common in the 80s and 90s, mainly focused on combatants within military structures. The second generation DDR, implemented since 2006, shifted away from military structures and promoted community-based lenses, notably through the initial implementation of community violence reduction projects to mitigate gang violence in Haiti. Most recently, the third generation has been implemented aiming at targeting a variety of new armed actors, including militia and extremist groups. In accordance with the revised integrated DDR standards, DDR constitutes an integrated process comprised by a combination of DDR programs, DDR-related tools, and reintegration support. Ideally, the implementation of DDR programs is associated with the fulfillment of specific preconditions, such as the signing of a negotiated ceasefire and/or peace agreement, trust in the peace process, willingness of the parties to the armed conflict to engage in DDR, and minimum security guarantees. However, in practice, DDR programs are implemented in complex environments to advance processes with signatory armed movements, while other armed actors still remain outside the peace process. When preconditions are not in place, DDR can still serve to provide immediate and targeted responses. These include pre-DDR, transitional weapons and ammunition management, community violence reduction, initiatives to prevent individuals from joining armed groups designated as terrorist organizations, Ddr Support to Mediation, and Ddr Support to Transitional Security Arrangements. In addition, support to programs for those leaving armed groups labeled and/or designated as terrorist organizations may also be provided by DDR practitioners in compliance with international standards. The flexibility and diversity of potential interventions allow the provision of support across the peace continuum, from prevention, conflict resolution and peacekeeping, to peace building and development. At all times, interventions should be context-specific and conflict-sensitive, aiming at promoting realistic interventions and preventing negative consequences. Moving forward, as a multidimensional approach, the effective implementation of DDR requires adequate coordination among a variety of national and international entities. The success of DDR also is interlinked with simultaneous progress in the political, social, and economic spheres. Currently, national and international actors face a variety of challenges notably the proliferation of state armed groups, the regionalization of violence, the absence of comprehensive agreements, and the surge of violent extremism. Considering these challenges, the implementation of DDR requires an in-depth assessment and analysis of conflict dynamics as well as individual and group motivations. Overall, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to DDR. The type and scope of DDR activities in a given region or country will be determined by multiple factors, including the existence of legal frameworks, national capacities, funding availability, international support, and interests of the parties of the country. For the past 30 years, the constant process of adaptation has allowed the compilation of extensive experience and knowledge of the coordination, design, implementation, financing, and monitoring and evaluation of DDR. Colombia illustrates the implementation of DDR processes at different stages of conflict and targeting numerous armed groups, from self-defense, criminal groups, and guerrilla. DDR processes have served to promote the voluntary exit from armed groups as well as part of the collective lay-down of weapons. In Ivory Coast and Sudan, thousands of combatants were effectively demobilized. Nonetheless, sustained reintegration support is always paramount for the effective return into civilian life and one of the biggest challenges we face in the field operations. In Somalia and Lake Chad countries, DDR has served to assist former members to come out of the armed groups. Interventions have been critical to rehabilitate and offer an opportunity for the integration into civilian life. However, in the absence of the comprehensive peace agreement, the armed groups have been able to regenerate and continue activities.
Now think about your own conflict context and consider whether or not the necessary preconditions for a DDR program are in place.
To understand how a practical DDR program can look like, let's focus on Mali and hear from our colleague Tahir. While looking at the video, note down what the DDR program entailed, who it was for, and what challenges arose.
My name is Tahir Ali. I'm Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration Team Leader, working with United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, normally known as MINUSMA. I've been deployed in one of the regions in the north. Any analysis of the situation in Mali must start by acknowledging that the most recent crisis was the country's fourth rebellion, and the third one to end with a negotiated agreement between the government of Mali and armed groups in the north. The agreement for peace and reconciliation in Mali, resulting from Ddr process, was signed in two stages on 15th May and 20th June 2015 respectively, and it was supposed to help in a new era of peace and stability in Mali. The armed movements entered the negotiations as two separate groups, the coordination of Azawad movements and the platform. Ddr's peace agreement comprehensively covers the provisions of defense and security measures to include cantonment and DDR, establishment of operational coordination mechanism, redeployment of reconstituted units, establishment of National DDR Commission, Integration Commission, and National Council on Security Sector Reform, and certainly the construction of the cantonment sites. MINUSMA was established in 2013 with clear mandate stipulating to support the cantonment, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of armed groups, including through the integration of elements of the signatory armed groups in Malian defense and security forces as an interim measure, and to continue implementation of community violence reduction program within the framework of an inclusive and consensual reform of the security sector, taking into account the particular needs of women and children and persons belonging to marginalized groups such as people with disabilities. The Algiers Peace Agreement stipulates Ddr process in the regions of the north of Mali, and there was no legal framework to launch the process in the center, which is Mopti region, which became an epicenter for the terrorist activities from 2018 onward, and it also resulted in change of MINUSMA's focus from north to center. With an agreement among signatory parties, the community rehabilitation program was launched in Mopti region in October 2019 with objectives to dismantle self-defense groups operating in the central region, as well as collecting illegal small arms held by the communities, including members affiliated to signatory armed movements. Under the guidance of Technical Commission on Security, 3 battalions of operational coordination mechanism with mixed patrols were established in 3 regions of the north of Mali, namely Gao, Kidal, and Timbuktu, with objectives of confidence building measures, cohesion, security to the cantonment Ddr process and the communities, including limiting access to the weapons and to prevent or to limit any security vacuum before, during, and after the cantonment process. In order to operationalize operational coordination mechanism, registration of combatants from the signatory armed movements and the compliant armed groups started in December 2016 with the launch of first mixed patrol in February 2017. Under the national ownership of the Ddr program, the National Ddr Commission, in coordination with Integration Commission and support from United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, officially launched the accelerated Ddr integration process in November 2018. With an agreement among signatory parties to the peace agreement, the first phase of the accelerated Ddr integration process started in the 3 regions of the north of Mali, including Gao, Kidal, and Timbuktu, with an objective to fast-track the integration of ex-combatants of operational coordination mechanism into Malian defense and security forces. This integration was in line with the agreed quota and integration criteria endorsed by the signatory parties to the peace agreement. Until today, 2,158 elements have been disarmed, out of which 1,734 elements have already been successfully integrated as part of the reconstituted army battalions and deployed in the north. During the implementation phase, the major challenges which were confronted are the unstable political situation in Mali, deteriorating security situation both in center and north, delay in finalization of quota and integration criteria, non-adherence of timelines by the signatory parties to the peace agreement, and lastly, the capacity of the national institutions or the structures to support the process. In order to support the cantonment and Ddr process, National Ddr Commission, Integration Commission, and National Council on Security Sector Reform were put in place as part of national institution and fully operationalized. To support the implementation of the national Ddr policy and the program, various standard operating procedures and support plans were put in place, like standard operating procedure on weapons and ammunition management, identification and screening process of ex-combatants entering the Ddr process, and support plan for the cantonment, Ddr, and integration process, including a fully developed biometric registration database. In the light of peace agreement, 8 cantonment sites were constructed in the 4 regions of north of Mali for the cantonment and Ddr process. In order to mitigate the impact of the cantonment and Ddr process, MINUSMA launched implementation of the community violence reduction projects in the vicinity of the cantonment sites for the communities, especially women and youth at risk, with the objectives to create an environment of social cohesion, confidence, and dialogue, besides providing temporary job opportunities to the communities. Ddr Processes Mali is under 4 phases. Phase 1 is the reintegration of those elements of Malian defense and security elements who deserted from service in 2012. Phase 2, integration of elements of the operational coordination mechanism into Malian defense and security forces. Phase 3, a global DDR process. And phase 4, it deals with the dismantling of militia and auto defense groups.
Think about your own country and consider whether the implementation of a DDR program as outlined by the colleague makes sense. Briefly summarize your thought process and provide 5 reasons why it might or might not work. As we have heard from our colleague Thomas, DDR can not only be used in a post-conflict situation, but can also used before conflict as a prevention tool and also during conflict to support stabilization. Always remember, whenever you plan for a DDR process, please conduct an in-depth assessment of the conflict context. This will help you to define what DDR response is most appropriate in your given situation. If it's not possible to conduct a DDR program, as there are certain conditions that will need to be in place, there are, however, DDR-related instruments you can use. We will not touch upon all the instruments that can be used, but will just portray 4 of these instruments. That is Ddr Support to Mediation, pre-DDR, Community Violence Reduction, and Transitional Weapons and Ammunition Management. We will elaborate on these tools now in this session.
Over the past 15 years, DDR has evolved from a traditional peacekeeping intervention that can be implemented in a post-conflict setting to what is now considered an integrated DDR process. Specifically with regard to DDR support to mediation processes, this aims at ensuring that any discussions around DDR during the peace process, and especially any clauses and provisions that are then part of peace agreements or ceasefire agreements, are actually implementable once the agreement has been signed by the former belligerents. Such support to mediation processes has been provided in several contexts. DDR expertise was part of and informed the peace process for Mali, the Algiers peace process. DDR expertise was also sought in the case of Colombia during the peace negotiations between the government and the FARC that were held in Havana. And more recently, DDR expertise has also informed the negotiations for the Central African Republic held in Khartoum, as well as more recently, the DDR also supported the negotiations for Libya.
Understanding and having insights into the positions and interests of armed forces and groups related to DDR can be of key importance for mediation processes. DDR practitioners can help with provisions for ceasefires, political agreements, but can also help with the implementation of a DDR program. DDR practitioners can provide advice on how to engage with armed forces and groups on DDR issues and how to contribute to reaching political agreements. This is of particular importance in contexts where peace agreements are partial, meaning that not all armed groups and forces have signed the peace agreement. This is also the case when armed groups lose trust in the peace agreement or do not adhere to the terms laid out in that same agreement.
In the context where DDR processes are being implemented, we often have seen widespread accumulation and misuse of conventional weapons and their ammunition, which contributes significantly to armed violence. So effective, safe, and secure weapons and ammunition management plays an increasingly important role in DDR processes to address this. It is particularly important that any disarmament or other weapons and ammunition management activities are conducted in compliance with international and regional arms control instruments, as well as with national legislations on weapons and ammunition. And in order to ensure the safety and security of these operations, activities must also be undertaken in line with international arms control standards and guidelines, such as the Modular Small Arms Control Implementation Compendium, MOSAIC for short, and the International Ammunition Technical Guidelines, which are also known as the ITG. Implementing arms control measures in line with these standards and guidelines is particularly critical for preventing the diversion of weapons and ammunition to unauthorized users, as well as preventing and mitigating accidental ammunition explosions. In line with the new UN approach to DDR, there are two arms control or weapons and ammunition management components of a DDR process. The first is, of course, disarmament operations that are conducted as part of a DDR program when the preconditions for such a program are in place. And the traditional focus of disarmament has, of course, been the collection, storage, and disposal of weapons and ammunition from ex-combatants, but also sometimes of civilian populations. And here it is key that international standards and guidelines related to weapons and ammunition accounting, transportation, storage, and destructions are followed. The primary aim of disarmament is to reduce the number of illicit arms and ammunition that are in circulation, but in some contexts, disarmament as part of a DDR program may not be the most suitable approach to control the circulation of weapons and ammunition and to achieve such a reduction of illicit flows. For these contexts, we have now available transitional weapons and ammunition management as a DDR-related tool, which allows us to address this reality going beyond the disarmament of combatants. Transitional weapons and ammunition management can be implemented when the preconditions for a DDR program are present or absent, and it can be either used instead of a disarmament activity as an alternative or in complement, depending on the context. The aim of transitional weapons and ammunition management is to reduce the capacity of individuals and groups to engage in violence, and it also seeks to address the risks related to the possession of weapons and ammunition. To make it a little bit more concrete, let me outline a few examples of transitional weapons and ammunition activities. It can, for instance, be used to improve and implement national arms control legislations, including provisions for weapons ownership that reflect regional and internationally legally binding instruments. It can also be used to increase national capacity of weapons and ammunition management, including in marking, record keeping, storage, and disposal, to ensure that these are in line with international standards and guidelines, and to support the development of related national action plans and standard operating procedures. In contexts where arms and ammunition are a primary security concern in the communities, community violence reduction can be complemented with transitional weapons and ammunition management. Specific arms control components can then be included in the CVR programming, including activities related to collecting, managing, and destroying weapons and ammunition. And these measures can serve various goals. First, they can delay access to weapons and ammunition to prevent interpersonal armed violence and accidents. And here activities can include raising awareness of the risks of keeping weapons in the home or in the house, and to install individual lockers in the communities. Secondly, transitional WAM as part of CVR can increase community oversight of weapons and ammunition ownership, and this can be done through community registration and the development of community storage facilities to ensure that the weapons and ammunition are stored safely and in a secure manner. And communities can also decide to establish, for instance, gun-free zones in certain areas to decrease armed violence. Another aim of transitional weapons and ammunition management as part of CVR can be circulation, for instance, through voluntary surrender and collection activities. And the willingness here of the community members to surrender such weapon will, of course, depend greatly on the perception of security, the existence of security threats, and the absence of criminal persecution when surrendering the weapons. Communities can also be encouraged to hand over a certain quantity of weapons as a precondition for benefiting from a CVR program. So you can see that transitional weapons and ammunition management is really a flexible approach to address the circulation of weapons and ammunition, and it importantly goes beyond the disarmament of combatants. To conclude, I would just like to draw your attention to the United Nations Handbook for DDR practitioners on weapons and ammunition management. I would invite you to consult this publication if you wish to receive additional guidance on the design and implementation of safe and secure disarmament operation and innovative transitional weapons and ammunition management activities as part of DDR processes. Thank you very much.
Now, let's take a look at the instrument of community violence reduction. What does it actually entail and what are the objectives? CVR can be used when the preconditions for a traditional DDR program are not in place, but it can also be used alongside a DDR program. Now, what is the objective? CVR is a tool that directly responds to the presence of active and or former members of armed forces and groups in a community and is designed to promote security and stability. When the preconditions for a traditional DDR program are not in place, CVR can also be used to promote security and stability in a certain community. It helps to make the returns of stability more tangible and to create more conducive environments for local and national peace processes to take root. CVR programs aim to provide alternatives to joining armed groups and help individuals to feel like part of the community. Remember, they shall not be used to provide material or financial assistance to active members of armed groups. The communities always plays a key role in CVR programs. The communities, in the end, design the program and they also help with its implementation. What does CVR entail? So what are the actual activities you can conduct? They are typically very short to medium term and include, but are not limited to, a wide range of activities. They can include weapons and ammunition management activities. They can include labor-intensive, short-term employment programs and activities, vocational skills training, community security, educational outreach and social mobilization, civic education, and it can also include awareness-raising programs with community members on gender, on women's empowerment and conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, prevention and response. Now, let's take a quick look at what is important when you plan and design and implement a DDR process, which may also include DDR-related tools. First of all, as we've outlined already, it's very important to have an in-depth assessment. The assessment will provide you with more information as to which DDR-related tool or instrument you can use. It helps you to get a better understanding of the conflict setting, the political and security situation, as well as the socio-economic context. The assessment will also provide you with more information on the appropriate settings for disarmament and the needs for the DDR program that you may implement. An important additional factor for the planning and design is also the national capacity that is available. You will also need to contemplate about the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders that are involved in the planning and implementation of a DDR process. Now think about your own context and consider which DDR-related tool may be helpful to use in your context. Briefly outline your thought process and provide 5 reasons for why you are using these instruments.
Now that we have heard about DDR-related tools, let's look at how this looks practically in the Central African Republic. Let's hear from Pierre. While listening to Pierre, please note down when the CVR program set in, what it entailed, and who it was for.
CVR is complementary to DDR. CVR is used as a strategic tool that takes into account the conflict mapping of any given country or context. CVR programs usually focus on areas where they are likely to have an important impact on stability. CVR programs also support the political strategy of a mission by encouraging dialogue at the community level, by supporting local peace agreements, ceasefires, and efforts that are designed to put an end to a conflict or violence and establish an environment that is conducive to the settlement of conflict, improvement of security, and also contribute to the protection of civilians. Now, let me start by saying that CVR programming is not a one-size-fits-all approach. In the first scenario, CVR can be implemented to support local peace agreements. In the case of Darfur, Sudan, during the migratory seasons, there is often conflict between farmers and herders. And this is due to the fact that during the migratory seasons, the migrants, while moving, the animals tend to encroach on farmland. And this sometimes culminates into deadly violence and conflict between farmers and herders. So CVR projects have been implemented in these areas, projects such as migratory routes, the demarcation of migratory routes, with the placement of water points in strategic areas where these water points were able to mutually benefit the herders and also the farmers. And this led to peaceful resolution and appeasement between farmers and herders. The second scenario, CVR is implemented in areas where DDR is about to be launched. Depending on the signed peace agreement, sometimes there are categories of armed groups that are not eligible to DDR because either they're not signatory to the peace agreement or the nature of the violence that they were engaged into is not also considered eligible to DDR. So it's important to cater for these groups through CVR programming. The third scenario, CVR is implemented in areas where DDR is likely to be delayed. This is the case of the Central African Republic. The national DDR program was only launched in December 2018. And so to secure the buy-in of armed groups as negotiations were still ongoing, CVR programming through income-generating activities, cash for work activities were implemented. And these projects played a major role in appeasing the communities. The fourth scenario is CVR is implemented in areas where DDR operations are not planned. And so it's important to also plan for areas where DDR operations are not planned, so to avoid that these areas will produce potential spoilers. So these are the four scenarios that CVR programming addresses. Thank you.
The community of Kilometer 5, or PK5 as it is commonly known, is considered to be the commercial center of Bangui, which is the capital city of the Central African Republic. The inhabitants of PK5 are predominantly Muslim and are mostly traders and shop owners within the community. In 2013, a pro-Muslim self-defense group was created in response to attacks from pro-Christian militia groups around the capital city of Bangui. And within a period spanning from 2013 to 2019, this pro-Muslim self-defense group from PK5 became partly responsible for a number of atrocities, killings, communal violence within the capital city of Bangui. Their activities also led to a complete isolation of the community of PK5 from the rest of
of Bangui, from other parts of Bangui. And there was also a complete shutdown or close down or breakdown, as you will, of state authority within the community of PK5. In 2019, the National Ddr program, which was launched in the previous year of 2018, had already started gaining momentum. But it became also very, very crucial that these communities in the hotspots areas it became crucial for them to be stabilized in order for the country to gain a comprehensive peace and stability. And one of the tools that was used to help stabilize these communities is the Community Violence Reduction Program, which was conceived to complement the National Ddr program by providing social and economic reinsertion support to those elements of armed groups that were not eligible to participate in the national program, Ddr program, and also other vulnerable members of the community, notably women and youth with conflict carrying capacity, meaning youth that are easily prone to violence or youth that could easily be recruited into armed activity or violent activities. And the Community Violence Reduction Program in PK5 capitalized on existing local peace and reconciliation mechanisms, notably peace agreements between PK5 and its neighboring communities. These peace agreements, which are locally referred to as good neighbor agreements, were facilitated by the Ministry of Reconciliation and Humanitarian Affairs. The ministry also had established local peace and reconciliation committees to facilitate the implementation of these local peace agreements. And these committees were also they also played a vital role in the planning and implementation of CVR, of the CVR projects that were implemented. The approach of the community violence reduction projects that were implemented in PK5 focused on bringing together the elements from the former self-defense group and other community members from within PK5 and also from other neighboring communities who had been in conflict previously. And the project provided economics, social support for vocational trainings, various vocational skills training, and also sensitization activities to foster social cohesion, peace and reconciliation, and cross-cutting issues such as civic education, and also sensitization for the prevention of COVID. The outcome of the intervention, the community violence reduction program intervention in PK5 was between 2019 to date, 2 phases of community violence reduction programs have been successfully completed, and these projects targeted a total of 1,911 beneficiaries, of which 1,050 were members of the former self-defense group, and the others were community members. It is important to note that while CVR cannot be the stabilization of PK5 cannot be attributed solely to the implementation of CVR, it is very important to know that it did form a very integral part of the stabilization of PK5 by providing an alternative to violence, to those elements that carried that had very high potential of returning to violence. Today, the community of PK5 is relatively stable, and there has been a progressive restoration of state authority. Thank you.
We now enter our last part of the training video on reintegration. Here we're going to look at why reintegration programs are important, what types exist, and what challenges exist. Reintegration is a key step to provide alternatives to violence and provide incentives to lay down arms. The transition from military to civilian life, however, can cause challenges for individuals and communities. Reintegration support can help to address these challenges and build resilience to re-recruitment and return to violence. Reintegration programs should not only focus on the economic support, but also on the many ways that community and individual resilience can be strengthened. That includes social and political assistance. Economically, vocational training to former members of armed groups and forces is not enough. These vocational trainings have to be linked to broader programs of employment creation and support to entrepreneurship. Socially, former members of armed forces and groups may face stigmatization, psychosocial and physical health issues that may impact their ability to be a full member of their community. To address these issues, reconciliation support may be considered, but also psychosocial support and social support networks. Politically, reintegration support may be used to encourage the participation and involvement of former members of armed forces and groups in decision and policy-making processes. While aiding former armed groups to transform into political parties is beyond the scope of a reintegration program, individuals and communities may be provided with civic and voter education and information on civil and political rights. There are different forms of reintegration support. For example, the targeted individual reintegration support. Targeted individual reintegration support is geared towards enhancing the employability of ex-combatants and persons formerly associated with armed forces and groups. This should help them to access productive assets and opportunities. It may, for example, include credit, technical advice, but also training and mentoring. The positive side of targeted individual reintegration support is that it can address the immediate needs of former members of armed forces and groups and their dependents. The negative side is that targeted support only focuses on former members of armed forces and groups and may create resentments towards ex-combatants and associated persons, making it more difficult for them to be accepted into the communities. Another reintegration support approach is community-based reintegration. Community-based reintegration is an approach that empowers people within communities to identify, plan, and implement programs. Community-based reintegration can, for example, include the support of the rehabilitation of shared community goods, such as wells, classrooms, markets, bridges, but also health facilities, irrigation channels, and other public infrastructure. Last but not least, there's also the approach of dual targeting. That means providing reintegration support that simultaneously targets individual former members of armed forces and groups and members of their communities. What you always have to keep in mind when planning for the reintegration program is a conflict and security analysis, a market analysis, and that also includes the private sector analysis, a review of the local economy's capacity to absorb cash inflation in cash-based transfers or others are being considered, a gender analysis, and also feasibility studies, and last but not least, assessments of the capacity of potential implementing partners. The challenges of reintegration are manifold, however. Reintegration is a less certain part of a DDR equation. Reintegration is a long-term process with uncertain outcomes. Recidivism due to external factors can always occur at any point. Donor reluctance due to that to provide the adequate funding which is necessary for broad-scale socioeconomic alternatives is lacking. In addition, the setup of these projects takes time until they can absorb large numbers of former combatants. Therefore, violence often resumes before projects can set in. Stigma and loss of social status often represent important hindrances for socioeconomic reintegration.
Think about your own context. What challenges do you see for the reintegration of ex-combatants? Name at least 5. What would need to be done to make reintegration sustainable in your context? Having learned some basic information about reintegration, let's look at what reintegration looks like in practice. We will listen to Lea, note down who the reintegration program was for and what particular challenges arose.
Reintegration, it's the most important phase of the Ddr process. It's during this phase that ex-combatant acquire civilian status and gain sustainable employment and income. Reintegration, it's actually the end state that combatants are hoping for when they decide to lay down their weapons. Reintegration, it's part of the long-term general development of a country and oftentimes necessitate long-term external support. In Mali, the Ddr team started planning for the reinsertion of ex-combatants even before the signing of the peace agreement. Consultants were hired to conduct a mapping of the socioeconomic opportunities in various key locations with a high presence of combatants. Following the establishment of the National Ddr Commission, a partnership was secured with the World Bank, which allocated 15 million for the reintegration of ex-combatants. Eligibility to participate in the reintegration program depends on the criteria set by the national entity in charge of the Ddr process. In Mali, not only ex-combatants but also community members are expected to benefit from the reintegration program. Reintegration is a long-term process with social, economic, and political dimensions. In Mali, while the reintegration phase has not yet started, the National Ddr Commission, in close coordination with MINUSMA, the peacekeeping operation, and the World Bank, have already outlined various aspects that need to be considered during the reintegration phase. These aspects include psychosocial, socioeconomic, and political support. The signatory armed movement in the north part of Mali have taken up weapons for political reasons, and support will be needed to facilitate the transformation of their political wings into political organizations once the key aspects of the peace agreement are implemented. Other elements of those armed groups have already expressed their willingness to return to a civilian life with support to access vocational training or implement income-generating activities in order to earn their living through alternative livelihoods. Psychosocial counseling, it's another key support that need to be available to ex-combatants who want it and not imposed to them for a better result. They need to know who to call or meet if they feel they need to talk. The support should also be available to community members. In Côte d'Ivoire, they have included psychosocial support in what they have termed the resocialization program. That was a program that the government has included in the demobilization phase. To be effective, reintegration assistance should include a mix of both individual and community-based initiatives. When providing socioeconomic assistance to ex-combatants, it is very important to ensure that the local and national job market has the capacity to absorb this new workforce. In most contexts, formal job market does not have many employment opportunities. Most jobs are created through the informal sector, with a particular focus on entrepreneurship. In this case, it is essential to ensure that ex-combatants are directed to economic sectors that have a good potential of growth and are part of the sectors that are targeted by the National Recovery and Development Plan. Reintegration is not an easy phase to implement, as it heavily depends on voluntary funding, which is not always easy to mobilize due to donor fatigue in some contexts. In addition, the transition of ex-combatant into civilian life, it's quite challenging, as communities are not oftentimes open to such transition because they still perceive the ex-combatant as a threat. There is therefore a need to prevent the stigmatization of this ex-combatant and foster community support through conducting a sensitization program before and during the reintegration phase to prepare the host community to accept the return and integrate the ex-combatant as part of the community. There is a need to implement initiatives that aim at facilitating social cohesion and reconciliation. In various contexts, music, sport, and other cultural events were used as a means to foster social cohesion and reconciliations. It is important to note that even when preconditions are not in place for a DDR program, reintegration support can still be implemented and play a specific role in sustaining peace. In the absence of a peace agreement, individuals may voluntarily exit armed forces or armed groups during all phases of the armed conflict. For instance, in the central part of Mali, Malian authorities in collaboration with MINUSMA and the World Bank are implementing the community rehabilitation program with the aim to promote the voluntary disarmament of self-defense and militia groups. No DDR process can be fully successful if we do not offer reintegration opportunity to ex-combatant and community members. Thank you.
Let's review what we have learned throughout this video. First of all, DDR is a process by which former combatants return to civilian life. It can support stabilization and sustainable development, and it can be an important tool in prevention and non-recurrence of violence. We have also learned about DDR programs. There are different options for disarmament and demobilization, depending on the existence of preconditions. There are also different forms of reintegration, depending on the socioeconomic context. We have also learned that you can choose to implement DDR-related tools in situations when the preconditions for a traditional DDR program are not in place. We have learned about 4 of these DDR-related instruments, which is Ddr Support to Mediation, pre-DDR, Community Violence Reduction, and Transitional Weapons and Ammunition Management. The last section of this video has dealt with reintegration support, and reintegration is the most complex and uncertain element of DD and R. There are different forms of reintegration support that you can provide. First of all, there's individual targeted assistance that you can provide. There's community-based reintegration support, and there is dual targeting. Last but not least, you have also learned about the important considerations for planning DDR processes. It's important to conduct an in-depth assessment in the beginning. It has to be conflict and context sensitive. It's important to define the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders involved in the planning and implementation of a DDR process very early in the beginning. And, most importantly, it's very important to keep local perspectives in mind. Thanks for listening to this video. We really hope it was helpful for you and your work.
A big thanks also goes to all the colleagues around the globe for contributing to this video with their experience and expertise.
If you have any specific questions on the content of this video, please don't hesitate to contact us.